A very good afternoon to all of you, and welcome to this uh, online session uh, in a series of topics on child and adolescent psychiatry. The first topic uh, and the topic for today is case formulation in child and adolescent psychiatry. So we'll go through as part of this topic, I'll be briefly covering about case formulation in the clinical settings. This presentation will not include case formulations that are done for psychotherapeutic interventions. Uh, Whatever be the method of or school of psychotherapeutic intervention, whether it's a psychodynamic psychotherapy or a cognitive behavior psychotherapy. So we are not getting into the psychotherapeutic case formulations. We will restrict ourselves to clinical case formulations in child and adolescent psychiatry. So at the outset, I would like to greet all of you on behalf of our Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at NIMHANS. And you can see the photographs on this slide. On the left side is our Child Psychiatry Center, an inpatient facility with dedicated 40 beds for children. And on the right side, you see an Adolescent Psychiatry Center, which is recently come into existence with about 24 inpatient beds for the adolescent age. So first and foremost, let us understand as to what is clinical case formulation. Various definitions have been given over a period of time about this concept of case formulation. As you can see on the slide, uh, it is basically linking up the information or data what we get from the patients as well as families, and to form a coherent pattern out of the data what we link up. And finally, it is something that assists the clinician to commence their therapeutic work, and also when they are doing therapy to predict the outcome in that given patient. So basically, it's a process of assimilation with whatever data or information we get. In the case of children, actually, this data usually is obtained from the child himself or herself, and also the parents, both the parents, and even the other important sources of information, the teachers, could be school teachers or tuition teachers. So the multiple sources of information is something very important, and this information is, as you all know, when we do a clinical evaluation, we have a specific format for detailed clinical evaluation, right from the basic socio-demographic details, from the presenting complaints and family history. So there is a specific format in which we collect the data and information. So all this data that is collected is basically assimilated to derive at the formulation. And as you can see on the slide, this is also we can say it's a hypothesis. The case formulation is a hypothesis, uh, because here the clinician is using the information to understand why these difficulties have arisen in that particular child, and what can be done about it, and also what is going to happen to this child, like what kind of treatment needs to be provided and what is going to happen to the child, that is a patient in this case. So having understood this broad definitions of case formulation, we will move on. And the case formulation is something that is central to the practice of child and adolescent psychiatry. uh, what researchers have shown is that often during our residency training, we are not formally taught about the case formulation. So generally, we spend some time teaching history taking in psychiatry and even in child psychiatry. But the case formulation is not given the kind of emphasis that it should receive during the residency training. And uh, that's where many a time we see that the residents, as well as once we move into our post residency period, either as senior residents or consultants, when we are seeing children, we are quite confused about how we have to treat a particular child's problem, how we need to assimilate all the information that the parents have given or the child has given. We might have collected a lot of historical details, how to make sense of that. So that's where I think it's very important for each one of us to learn the skill of uh, assimilating the information into a good formulation. And as you can see, there are some important attributes of a good formulation. First and foremost, actually, there is a theoretical basis of this for this, and this should the formulation should be something that is sensitive about the patient, and also it should specifically apply to the patient. The specificity part is very important. Irrespective of the diagnosis of a patient, the patient's whatever the information that has been obtained is very specific. Like, you may have different diagnostic labels as per your ICD or DSM system of classification, and we all keep saying that no two patients are the same. To give you an example, you might have made a diagnosis of obsessive compulsive disorder, and you might have seen several children with this particular diagnosis. But if you look at some of the information received for each case in the case history, there are lots and lots of differences. And finally, the diagnosis may be the same based upon certain diagnostic criteria of these respective classifications. But when you try to formulate, you formulate with a specificity for that particular patient. And also, one needs to understand that this is a testable explanatory model, because what we are trying to do is we are trying to explain the patient's present condition or illness based on several factors and the cumulative effect of those factors and the complex interactions between these factors. And this explanatory model, first and foremost, in the formulation, we have to develop, and we ourselves as clinicians need to understand. And then we will have to, in a very simple, meaningful way, we have to explain to the families as well as to the patient themselves, so that they will also be able to understand as to why they are having this condition and what is the condition, and what kind of treatments are available, what should they expect from these treatments, etc. So moving on, like, the formulation is something, no in one of the researchers had summarized it very beautifully, saying that it tells us as to what is wrong, how it got wrong in that way, and what can be done about it. All of you may be very familiar about this particular model, which we commonly keep using in our psychiatric practice in terms of formulating interventions, called as a biopsychosocial model. In the biopsychosocial model, we talk of biological factors as well as several psychosocial factors that influence the onset as well as the progression of a particular condition. And also, when we plan the interventions, we say that we have to provide certain interventions to address the biological factors as well as the psychosocial factors. So this concept of biopsychosocial model was originally proposed by George Engel, and this has been one of the most useful models to understand the case formulation. So case formulation is also a dynamic concept, and it's not something that is static. For example, no, if I receive some information about the child in the initial session, I formulate it in a particular way. But during the second and subsequent sessions, I may get more additional information relevant to that particular child. And I'll have to include those information into the case formulation to continuously modify it. And that's why it's quite dynamic, and it's not a static kind of concept. And as you can see on the slide, it may start with a very rudimentary kind of state, and over a period of time it becomes more crystallized into a more elaborate kind of framework with a clear structure, and which can relate to the clinician's understanding of the patient's conditions. So why formulation is important for treatment is that if we just go by the diagnosis of the patient, and if we decide the treatment, it's not going to be that comprehensive. But if we are able to address all the factors or all the information that we have included in developing the case formulation, that kind of treatment will definitely be more comprehensive, because we are able to address all the vulnerabilities and the strengths in that given individual, and then we are basing our treatment on that. There are certain misconceptions about the case formulation. Uh, some of the clinicians, they have this misconception saying that only long-term cases require case formulation, and case formulation is something that is time-consuming, elaborate, so we can skip that. It need not be done, and it's unnecessary, laborious process kind of thing. Uh, Also, people they have this opinion saying that just writing the diagnosis is enough, and directly we can start the treatment, because there are clear guidelines for diagnosis, and also there are established practice parameters or clinical practice guidelines for treatment. So we can directly go to that. What is the need for a written case formulation? That's what many people they feel, which is not right. So also another concern is that we'll end up spending a lot of time on this case formulation, and we will give less and less time to actual communication with the patient. That's not right. We can allocate sufficient amount of time for the communication with the patient also. That's where I think, especially in child psychiatric practice, it's important to understand that right from the first consultation, where you start getting that initial information about the presenting problems, and also some details you will get about the social demographics of that particular child, and also the certain family factors. The formulation itself, and also actually communication to the patient about the case formulation and actual initiation of therapy and the follow-ups may take several sessions together. It's not just a one-off kind of thing. So case formulation itself includes certain factors, as you can see on the slide. And one way of remembering these factors is by the alphabet P. So predisposing factors, precipitating factors, perpetuating factors, and protective factors. And these are initially, like, this concept of 4 P's of case formulation has been widely accepted. And some of the authors, they add another P also, that is a 5th P, that is a prognosis. We'll look at each of these factors in detail now. So first and foremost, the predisposing factors. So predisposing factors are usually factors that are existing in that individual over a period of time. Like, these are generally not within a short span, like within a week or within a month's time. The predisposing factors have existed in the individual probably for several months, even some years together, or right from the childhood, or sometimes even for children. This may be from the time that the mother becomes pregnant. So the predisposing factors definitely will include the areas of vulnerability that increase the risk for the presenting problem. So when we say that some person is predisposed to a particular condition, that means that he has some kind of vulnerability that has existed for a long time. And here you can see that family history is one of the factors, or certain genetic risk that is there for a given underlying condition. The past medical and psychiatric history, presence of chronic stressors, and also antenatal, perinatal, and postnatal factors, influence of our role of caregivers in child's early years. These are all kind of predisposing factors for a given child. And you can see that I have given certain examples. The list can be long, but in this presentation, I have just included these examples to give you some understanding about this concept of predisposing factors. Say, for example, during the early pregnancy period, if the mother has a problem of malnutrition, so that is going to definitely have an impact on the development of the fetus. And there is enough literature that is available now that suggests that this can lead to problems in the neural development of the child, and also this can predispose to later onset of psychiatric conditions. similarly, the family history of psychiatric illness. So we all know that no, this is something important information we elicit in the history taking during history taking, and the family history, especially in the first generation of the child, first degree relatives, what we call, that is confers greater amount of risk compared to the family history in second degree relatives or distant relatives. Then factors like marital discord between parents, and also child getting separated from the parents, and probably some of the children, they will be growing up in some institutions, or they will be taken care of some other caretakers or relatives. Um, and the abuse and neglect kind of situation that the children encounter over a period of time, and even certain social kind of factors, like for example poverty which the family is going through, and some of the long standing kind of factors that are contributed more by the biology in that particular individual. In the adults, we call it as a personality. In the case of children, there is this word that is used called temperament. So, say for example, if the child has a difficult temperament, uh, that child may be predisposed to certain kinds of problems, especially the behavioral problems more commonly. So, these are all the examples of predisposing factors. Then the precipitating factors. So precipitating factors are something that is more recent, which are probably in the form of certain life events, maybe positive or negative life events, or some recent stress that has affected the child or the family. And we should understand when we are talking about all these factors, the important thing what we need to remember in child psychiatry is that uh, the child has to be understood as an individual who is embedded within the family system, and also the family is embedded in a larger system, which is the social neighborhood, and also the other systems that are there out in the society. So each of these are quite interactive, and finally they have an impact, either a positive or negative impact on the child. So that's the kind of understanding we need to have to imagine the child in the midst of these kind of systems, wherein anything, any stress or any event, either positive or negative, affecting any one family member who is related to a child, or even some event that happens in the neighborhood, can have an influence of the child. The intensity and the kind of impact may vary from child to child. And sometimes what happens is these precipitating factors can actually act as imminent triggers for somebody to develop a first episode of a psychiatric illness, maybe something like a depression or an anxiety disorder, or other kinds of conditions, even severe conditions like psychosis. This particular phenomena is called as brought forward phenomena, wherein individuals who are at risk due to certain predisposing vulnerabilities, once they develop a precipitating factor, the occurrence of this illness is happens imminently, and no, there is no such delay that happens. Also, we see that the precipitating factors interact closely with the predisposing factors, and these precipitating factors, sometimes we can see that in few cases it may be multiple also. And precipitating factors influence the help seeking. Uh, like depending on the nature and intensity of the precipitating factor and the aftermath of that, like suppose if there is an onset of some clear symptoms of a psychiatric illness, in the immediate aftermath of the precipitating factors, the families generally, they notice the changes in the behavior of the child and changes in the functioning of the child, and they immediately seek help. So let us move on to the next slide. uh, some examples of these precipitating factors: in the case of children, this could be a failure in examinations, or it could be a death of a grandparent. Even the positive kind of factors, like for example birth of a sibling. So here uh, it is probably a joyous occasion for the family, but at the same time for the child, he has to get adjusted with the new entrant into the family. And also it means that for the mother, it's something like where the mother has to provide her care to both these children, uh, the our patient himself or herself, and also the younger sibling who is born. And say for example a parent, especially when the mothers who are the primary caregivers, they start their job, um, or when the change of school happens, or if a bullying happens in the neighborhood, or even certain physical conditions like we very commonly, especially during this season, we see that the dengue and certain other infections. Now we are having this COVID kind of situation. So if for any reason child develops some physical illness and gets hospitalized for that, or has to take some treatment, this itself can act as a stressor and a precipitating factor. So then going to perpetuating factors are also called as maintaining factors, and these factors exist, you know, for a period of time. Sometimes this can exist for several years, and we will have to definitely address these factors, not just the symptoms in a given individual, because sometimes these factors may result in delayed help seeking, or a child who is otherwise having a diagnosis which is no very much treatable with the pharmacotherapy and psychotherapeutic interventions may develop a treatment refractory situation, because the underlying maintaining factors, that is within the patient himself or herself, or the family or the community or larger system, they continue to maintain these symptoms rather than ameliorate the symptoms. So one of the examples is the marital conflict between parents, and the child may be having certain undiagnosed problems which are there pre-existent, like for example developmental conditions in child. To give you a clear example, you might have diagnosed the child with a mood disorder, an anxiety disorder, but you might have missed the presence of a developmental condition like ADHD or autism spectrum disorder, or a mild or moderate intellectual disability. So when we are managing the anxiety disorder or mood disorder with medication and other forms of treatment, unless and until you address these developmental issues, the child will continue to have some impairment of functioning. Uh, the next example is that of the parenting style, wherein like in some families we see that the way the parents parent their children is no more of a punitive kind of style, or sometimes we may see that the other way around, like they may be very permissive. So these kind of factors also in the parenting, and mainly these are family factors that are directly influencing child. They can act as perpetuating factors. And parental physical or psychiatric illness is something, a very important factor that is often missed. And also we know that especially in the general hospital, those of you who are primarily working in the general hospital psychiatry units, you may be coming across a lot of children with physical health problems, especially some of the chronic physical illnesses, and in that context development of psychological problems, and even the psychological problems may go to the extent of a known psychiatric diagnosis. That's where I think this background of this chronic physical illness may act as either a predisposing, and even sometimes if they continue they can act as a perpetuating factor also. So the next important thing what we need to understand is what we call as a protective factors. So protective factors are something like where, say for example, we come across some children irrespective of the diagnosis, and this is something we'll have to look for in every child, and we need to elicit the information. Sometimes parents may not report this spontaneously, and in fact, many a time what we see is parents, when they bring the children, they list out several complaints, like saying that my child is not eating, my child is not sleeping, my child is not going to school, he is not studying, and he doesn't behave properly, he's rude, he's beating his siblings, he's all sorts of things, all sorts of negative things will be said about the child. uh, so and even in a busy OPD, sometimes we may forget to ask about some of the skills of the child, or some of the talents, or some of the child's specific interests or hobbies, or the child's areas of competency. Sometimes the children may be very good at certain things, and they may be very skilled. So these factors are not elicited. Or even some of the important aspects of their temperament, like for example, some children, they are very well adjusted with others, and in different circumstances they get easily adjusted, and they have what we call as a very easy temperament, and generally their mood is very stable, and they are not going to react impulsively to any situation. These are certain positive things, and that needs to be noted down. These definitely are protective factors for that individual. And also it is very important to work on these factors, to enhance these factors in every child, to arrive at a better outcome. So this is one of the things that we can actually work on to improve the outcomes in a given child. So I have listed some of the examples here. Uh, Temperament I already mentioned. Uh, One factor that has been shown in lot of research studies, uh, even some of the recent research studies with lot of biological kind of underpinnings also, is that the attachment patterns with the primary caregiver. Like suppose a newborn, from that age onwards, like a newborn child, as they go through their infancy, toddlerhood, and all. So as they receive a lot of emotional support, warmth, and lot of caring by the primary caregiver, and if they develop good attachment with the primary caregiver, this is said to be one a protective factor for the child. Also having stable family relationships, good academic achievement, good interpersonal adjustment with the peers and teachers. And also you might be familiar with this particular construct of life skills. So this is something we keep training most of the older children and adolescents in the school settings as a mental health promotion or prevention kind of strategy. So having good among these life skills, having good coping skills, decision making, problem solving skills, etc., these are definitely examples of protective factors in children. So we will spend a couple of minutes on this table, which is basically on, you can see that on the left side there is a, all these factors are mentioned one below the other: predisposing, precipitating, perpetuating, and protective factors. And then we have on the right side columns, we have biopsychosocial kind of approach, like that is biological, psychological, and social. And under each of these things, you have the specific things mentioned. Like for example, biologic, we have genetic, medical, developmental, certain toxicities or temperamental factors. And similarly, in the psychological, we have cognitive style, and their intrapsychic conflicts or defense mechanisms, or how they attribute their symptoms and what is their self-image. And then in the terms of social, uh, more immediate kind of relationships, that is with the family, peers, etc. Then the larger social environment, culture, ethnicity, etc. So um, this particular table I have taken from one of the articles which I have given in the reference slide in the end. This at the Clinics of North America Journal, and it's a very good article on case formulation. So you can go through that. So you can just look at the reference slide. That article is available in the Google. You can just get a full text of this article and go through this article. So this particular table or this particular template, I can say, is, or a grid, is something we have to practice for a given child. Once we get the information, then you will have to put this as a table, like 3 factors on the top, like biological, psychological, social, and 4 factors, below that, like, or to the left. And a grid can be developed, 4 into 3 kind of grid, where you note down all these things for each child. So you are very clear about predisposing biological factors in the child, predisposing psychological factors, similarly predisposing social factors, then precipitating factors at all levels: biological, psychological, and social. Similarly, maintaining or perpetuating factors in biological, psychological, social, and protective factors. So I think for a thorough understanding, no, learning this particular plotting or mapping of these factors is very important, and understanding the role of each of these factors. And you can see that these factors, uh, sometimes it may be loaded too much on the precipitating factors in a given child. In a given child, actually, it may be the other way around. Like precipitating factors may not be that much, but the child may have a lot of predisposing kind of vulnerabilities and also some maintaining factors. So anyway, it may go, and it's very important to have this particular template in mind. And um, the best thing to do is for you, whenever you obtain information from any child or caregiver, to elicit all this information related to these factors, and probably plot this table before you write the formulation. That's a good practice to follow. And finally, I want to give this format of case formulation. First and foremost, we have to write a summarizing statement about key demographic information presenting complaints and perspectives of child and parents. So we'll have to say that so-and-so child aged 6 years, coming from middle socioeconomic status, urban background, and he's presenting with these complaints of school refusal, and this is the perspective of the child, this is the perspective of the parent. Then it has been precipitated by the recent onset fever or some kind of condition you have to mention. Then we will have to describe the biological characterization, then the psychological characterization of that child, then each of these factors, family and other interpersonal factors, socio-cultural and environmental factors, functioning of the child in all domains, and strengths and protective factors we should not forget, and then we should mention the differential diagnosis, and finally we should give an integrative statement that gives an overall kind of picture about these 4 P's in this given child. So what were the predisposing factors in this given child? What were the precipitating factors in this given child? What were the perpetuating or maintaining factors? And what are the protective factors in this child? And then based upon that, like, what are my targets or what is a problem list? Just listing out the targets. Like for example, aggression could be a target. Then oppositional behavior can be a target. School refusal behavior can be a target. Poor sleep can be a target. Depressed mood can be a target. So like that, we have to write down the problem list, and then we will have to, the last but not the least, the treatment plan. We will have to clearly spell out what are we going to do in terms of pharmacotherapy and also psychosocial treatment. And this is something, as initially I mentioned, this is quite a dynamic concept. And in the beginning stages, you will not get all this information. You will not be able to give a very comprehensive case formulation. But as you go along and spending more and more time with the child, family, get lots and lots of information. And as you go along also, when you apply certain treatments, you will observe that certain things you have not included as factors. Then you assimilate it. Like that, it undergoes a lot of these modifications. And by the time you have some 4 or 5 sessions or even more number of sessions, you will have a good case formulation for you to proceed in terms of your therapy. So with that, I would like to give this certain take-home messages before I end my presentation. Case formulation is a very important element of clinical evaluation of every child or adolescent. And this is a skill that needs to be practiced, the skill of drafting good case formulations. Also, we need to understand that as it requires a lot of information about predisposing, precipitating, perpetuating, protective factors, one needs to do a thorough clinical assessment before we start formulating a case. And also, good case formulations definitely are helpful to base our treatment solidly, and they will definitely result in favorable outcomes. And especially for eliciting this information about the 4 P's, we have to develop this collaborative approach. That is something I think is a key element in child and adolescent psychiatric practice. A collaborative approach with the child, family, and the other relevant stakeholders. It could be teachers and other people who provide all this information. In eliciting each of these factors more lucidly, that is very important. And last but not the least, whatever formulation we get, I think educating the parents is very important. And this will help in enhancing the family's involvement in the child's treatment. So that will be definitely helping in the child's progress over a period of time, and eventually the prognosis of the child. And with this, I end my presentation. And these are some of the references. And the last reference by Winters and colleagues, titled "The Case Formulation, Child and Adolescent Psychiatry." That is an article which is a very useful article for you as a regular reference kind of article when you learn about case formulation, child and adolescent psychiatry. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So myself Rajendra. So thanks for the class, sir. Like I'm taking part of Dr. Chetan. So any questions and clarifications you people have, you can unmute your mic, ask, or you can message us.
Okay, I think there is a question saying that should we restrict ourselves only to information that is directly linked with the child's psychopathology? This is from Dr. Kanakarajan, Dr. Sham Kanakarajan. So I think that is a very important question. We definitely should not restrict ourselves to this psychopathology, and no, it's not just the symptoms or the symptom manifestations in the child. Those are very important to the diagnosis. And typically we use that to diagnose a child with a particular condition using the ICD or DSM criteria and the diagnostic workup. But case formulation is something beyond that, and definitely psychopathology needs to be included. But also, as I mentioned, there are a lot of other factors that influence the uh, the onset of that particular condition in the child. As I mentioned, these four P's: predisposing, precipitating, protective, and perpetuating kind of factors. So we need to elicit the information related to all those things. Okay, like there is a question from, I think, Dr. Jwalamukhi. So she mentions that was a case also presented as an example. We have not presented a case in this session. I think it's a very useful suggestion. We will plan that during our next session. At least we ensure that one case will be presented, and maybe we'll have one session like that where we'll bring a case and we'll present the case history, and then we can actually formulate that case. We'll do that. And okay, there is also another question from Dr. Mary Bosco, who asks the difference between case formulation in children and adults. Well, even in the case of adults, case formulation is something very important. But I would say in the child, certain factors are very unique. Like, for example, in terms of the child's relationship with the parents and parenting style, and even the early childhood experiences. I have mentioned about some of the caregiving experiences right from the infancy period. And also, even this goes back to the pregnancy time, wherein certain biological factors, like certain antenatal factors, say the mother had some malnutrition, or she had some things like, say, hypertension or gestational diabetes, or mother herself had some viral infection. So all these things are known to have an impact on the child development. So that is one difference. The other one, of course, in child, typically this information also, it requires much more time to elicit, and that you may be familiar with that. Like, even the history taking in child and adolescent psychiatry requires more time, and typically multiple informants will be involved, and the child initially may be non-cooperative for this or uncooperative for this particular exercise, and we will have to, especially in smaller children, we will have to observe their behaviors over several sessions. And in older children especially, they may not be very cooperative initially. We have to establish the rapport, and there may be certain sensitive informations which the child may share with us, may not be sharing with the parents initially. So all these complexities are involved when we work with children. And I think no when we elicit the information, when we take the history, we have to spend that amount of time before we come to a case formulation stage in the case of children. Okay, how to formulate if the child has multiple diagnoses? This is a question that has been asked by Dr. Krishnavasan. Um, Typically, children and adolescents have multiple diagnoses. So, it's especially in the clinical settings, what we see is the multiple diagnosis is very common. And even for those diagnoses, we can, like, definitely the underlying factors, whatever are there, we can elicit all those factors and we can formulate. So there is no limitation that just one diagnosis we can do case formulation, the other diagnosis we can't do. Irrespective of the number of diagnosis and the type of diagnosis, we need to elicit all these factors what I mentioned in the lecture, like predisposing and the other factors, to arrive at the case formulation. Is it possible to share the usual practical procedure that you follow during the case formulation? Yes, as I have mentioned, like this question is from Dr. Janaki Thomas. We will be planning one case presentation. We will take on sample case history, and we will provide you all the details. And then we will provide the case formulation for that. We will do that exercise online so that you will get an idea of this case formulation, how it is actually done practically. Now you might have got some exposure of this case formulation as a theoretical background. Okay, how successful our case formulation and diagnose will be if we couldn't elicit predisposing factors? A question by Dr. Surya. Um, well, like it will definitely be a gap, information gap with regards to non-elicitation of these predisposing factors, because all these factors put together will strengthen the case formulation. And sometimes we see that the historical information itself may be inadequate, like because that relevant informant may not be able to give that kind of information. So all these limitations will definitely be there. So in those cases, actually case formulation, there will be some lacuna in that. But as I would like to add one point here, we should always, once we develop the skill of eliciting history and formulating the kind of drafting the case formulations, we should practice more and more, and we should ensure that we have at least a checklist of the common predisposing or precipitating factors, and keep asking to the parents and routine check kind of thing, so that we are not missing anything. What are the main difficulties that come across while case formulation? How can they be managed? Okay. Well, the difficulties, I would say more than difficulties, these are certain challenges. As I mentioned, like in some children, we will not get adequate information in the history itself. Then there will be huge gaps in the history, and it will be difficult for us to formulate the case. And sometimes what happens is time is a very important factor, as I mentioned. So if we are given ample time, we can actually, because I initially have mentioned that this is a testable hypothesis, and also I mentioned that this is quite dynamic. As we go along, we improvise this. Sometimes we may not have the luxury of the time. We may see that child once or twice, that's all. So there really we may struggle to develop a good case formulation. How is case summary different from formulation, or both necessary, or a good case formulation would suffice? So case summary is something different from case formulation that you need to understand. Case summary is just summarizing the information that is given. It's not a formulation. So in the formulation, it has a clear structure where you are looking at the predisposing, precipitating, and perpetuating factors along with the protective factors, and also you are including along this biopsychosocial kind of domains, and then you are giving an integrative statement, like saying that how these factors have interacted in that given child and led to the diagnosis. Whereas case summary is just stating, summarizing the facts what you have obtained without going into this kind of structure. Is it appropriate to include attachment theory or psychosocial and cognitive stages of children in drafting a formulation? Yes, it is very much appropriate. Like some of these variables, they fall under the psychosocial or primarily psychological kind of domain, as certain predisposing kind of factors, and we need to include that. Yeah, resistance from patients make a huge difference in case formulation. Could you please share any experiences? I agree with that. So I think that's where before case formulation is a stage that comes after that initial clinical evaluation stage, where you spend a lot of time taking the history and arriving at a diagnosis or arriving at a differential diagnosis. So first and foremost, I think whenever you are working with children and with families, I had highlighted the collaborative approach in my last slide. So I think you need to develop the skill to basically, I think we need to be comfortable with children of different age groups, and also how we are going to, like, suppose if say a 2-year-old child is with you, or a 12-year-old child is there, or a 16-year-old adolescent is in the
Yes.
room, how are you going to interact with them? And how are you going to make it as an age appropriate and more meaningful interaction with that particular individual? What kind of language you will use, and what kind of like, for example, especially small children, you will do some activities and build rapport with them. All these things initially have to be done to address this resistance. And in some, this resistance again, it can happen in the children or it can happen in the parents also. And it can happen to varying degrees. In some people, we see that there is lot of resistance with regards to help seeking. It may be due to several factors like stigma, etc. um, so, or there may be concerns about the a particular diagnosis, or also certain issues about confidentiality, all these things. You can address all those things, and depending on the level or degree of resistance, you will have to address that. What are the interventions that are mainly done for children and adolescents with psychiatric illness? So this is a question from Dr. Mary Bosco. So there are, I think what I would like to say is 100% of the children and adolescents with psychiatric illness, they require psychosocial interventions. And around 30 to 40% of them require some pharmacotherapeutic interventions. So that means that almost all children whom you see, almost all children and adolescents you see in the clinics, they require some or the other form of psychosocial intervention. And around 30 to 40% of them require specific psychotropic medications depending on the target symptoms.
So I was thanking Dr. John Vijay Sagar sir for the presentation, and I was mentioning that following this presentation, there will be series of presentation which will be on the topics related to child and adolescent mental health, and we will try to answer the few other questions also in the upcoming sessions, in the relevant sessions. So thanks one and all. Thanks again from John sir.
Yeah, thank you for your active participation in the session, and we look forward to your active participation in the next sessions also, because and we thank the team at the Telemedicine Center NIMHANS for having facilitated these sessions. Thank you.